So, a couple things off the top. I mentioned last class, and I put up an announcement. My office hours yesterday. Some of you I didn't, I guess, listen or didn't quite catch. Well, I had to cancel them. I ended up being around during part of my office hours in the afternoon, and a couple people caught me. And I also met some people virtually. But I moved those office hours to Friday to be 10 to 11, 1 to 3, approximately the same times as they were on Wednesday. But I had to move them this week. So if you want to stop by and have any questions, I'll be there in those time blocks to answer questions tomorrow. Should maybe help if you're kind of studying for that Module 11 quiz, which will have a Module 11 quiz, and then the Module 12 reading will pop up after we're done with class today. Those will both be due on the end of the day, Monday. All right, so we're back in the swing of things. That module quiz, so last week there was like 5 or 6 people in each section. That some of the pictures, so the graph, it would show up for like question 2 or 3, but not 4. It's the same, was the same picture, so I really was at a loss. I've talked with some tech people. I think I know why, but I've got to change some things in the quiz that might take me a little bit of time today. So it'll probably pop up a little bit later today than it usually does. Usually it pops up right at 11:30. I have it set to be released. It might not show up until like 2:33 this afternoon. I've got some other classes in between. I'm going to try to kind of make those edits just to make sure that that doesn't happen to anybody. Like I said, it was only 5 or 6 people, but that's still 5 or 6 people. So I want to try to make sure that that doesn't happen. Now, if it does, everyone that happened to correctly took screenshots so they could kind of show me what they were seeing. Was great. And it shouldn't happen moving forward. But if it does, the pictures I'm giving you, usually it's the same picture for like 3 or 4 questions. So for some reason, like one of the pictures doesn't show up, look up at the question previous. And if you have a picture of a graph there, it's the same graph. Right now, once again, I think I know after talking to them what will shut that down. So that shouldn't happen this week, but that's why the quiz will pop up a little bit later today. Okay. Other than that, CL sessions are kind of scheduled tonight and Sunday. There's one session the leader will not be able to be there tonight. I forget exactly the room number. I'll put an announcement up on Canvas that has it, but it's the very first time block. There's still 2 other sessions at that time block, so there's still a CL session at every single time you can attend. But there's going to be one of the rooms that won't have someone in it that usually does, right? So I'll post that up on Canvas exactly what room that is. I believe it's the one that's on 2000 or 200, whatever the room number ends up being. But I'll post up what that room number is when I get back to my office today. I just got that email this morning that they're not going to be able to make it. Okay. Other than that, I think only other thing I wanted to mention, so let's come down here. I put up that 4th pack back. So I said, you can start on it already. But after today's class, we'll talk about all the issues related to monopolies that allow you to really probably give a much more detailed and thoughtful response to that. So get on, they'll be due at the end of the day next Friday. So get on, get that done early. Get your original kind of question response to my guide post. Quicker that you get yours out there, other people do, the quicker you can get your responses to other people's posts. So you getting on there, getting it done quickly, create some positive externalities for the rest of the class, right? So don't wait and do it next Friday and then say, or I forgot or something, send me, get on, get it done, get out of the way easy. Once again, these pack assignments, it's supposed to kind of make you start to think about some of these real world issues, what we see in practice with monopolies, but also it's a way for me to kind of give you some effort-based points, right? So if you're worried about your exam performance, this is an area where you can get some easy effort-based points, okay? Other than that, the quiz from last class and today, because I usually would want to just give you half points for correct. There's just being graded off correctness. So I'll probably put up a scaled version of both of those. So if you got all the points, your grade's not going to change. But if you got questions wrong, I'll give you half points for just kind of responding and then half for correctness. So you'll see those kind of get updated if you missed any points. Now, if you're in class, you shouldn't be missing any going through these with you. So that shouldn't really hardly impact anyone. But kind of lining up the syllabus, I'm going to make sure I get those updated so you get half points for correctness on both the ones from Tuesday and today. I'll also get up the recordings. So once again, I'm being a little bit, I said, don't always kind of rely on those. I'll get both of those uploaded later this afternoon as well, as soon as they're done compiling from today's class. Okay. All right. That should be all the housekeeping stuff, I believe. Any logistic questions for me before we jump into material here today? Good. All right. So let's keep talking about monopolies. Okay. So where did we leave off? Right. We were talking about single price monopolists. Today, we're going to start to compare those more in depth to perfectly competitive markets, and then we end up calling price discriminating monopolies. So if we had a perfectly competitive market, where's the equilibrium? Where supply is equal to demand, right? Now, if we have one firm, this is where I'm getting questions from people coming by. We've got to know this, right? In a market, what represents the marginal benefit to consumers? Demand, right? That's people demanding, buying products that represents their marginal benefit. What represents the marginal cost to consumers or producers? Supply. So if I have one firm, their marginal cost curve is the supply curve. So here we are, perfectly competitive equilibrium, right? Where that supply curve or the marginal cost of one firm will be equal to demand. The single price monopolist, though, makes decisions based off of what? Where marginal cost is equal to, I said this probably 30 times last class, marginal revenue. What marginal revenue curve do they face? It's going to be twice as steep as demand. I went through kind of the mathematical support. We looked at the table. I said if it's easier, you can just remember it's always twice as steep as demand. We'll work through some equations with this today as well. So they figure out where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost? That's the profit maximizing quantity. However, they don't just set the price there. They go up to the demand curve because the demand curve tells us how much that consumer was willing to pay at that unit. That's where we'll set the price, right? So we said we can think about all these units that the monopolist isn't selling. This would represent, well, we're not selling those units anymore. All the surplus would be loss or our deadweight loss. So the next thing that we'll kind of do today is think about, all right, we can identify deadweight loss. I did some foreshadowing. We talked about this a little bit last class. What's going to happen at producer and consumer surplus? So just intuitively, the price that a monopolist charges, is that going to be higher or lower than the perfectly competitive price? Higher. So what's going to happen? Is that going to be a good or bad thing for consumers? It's not a trick question. You pay a higher price as a consumer, that is a bad thing. So what's going to happen to consumer surplus? It's going to go down. Selling at a higher price, is that going to be a good or a bad thing for producers? So producer surplus should go up. So let's kind of think about exactly why this is, and I'll kind of give you some equations that we can kind of line up with this as well, okay? And I'll return to these slides. I'm just going to kind of draw something out for us here, okay? So I'm going to put some equations to this and then kind of talk through it more generally as well, right? So if I've got my demand curve, well, I'll hold off on the equations. Let's do this. Let's say I've got my supply and demand curve, right? Supply is going to be based off of the marginal cost of that one firm, the monopolist. So if they're going to make a decision based off of this twice as steep marginal revenue curve, they choose that quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. We're still with a single price monopolist. They then go up to the demand curve to set the price, okay? So if I'm thinking about consumer surplus, anytime we talk about surplus, it's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. It's just now we're thinking about the marginal benefits and marginal costs of the consumer. So what is the marginal benefit to the consumer? Represented by our demand curve. We need to know this. If we don't, this is not going to play out well in the final, right? So here, demand represents their marginal benefits. What's the marginal cost to the consumer? Whatever they are paying or the price. Now, in this case, we're looking at the monopoly price. Right? So where would consumer surplus be here? I said a less technical way of remembering this. This applied to all the other stuff we've talked about this semester. It's going to be the area, in this case, it happens to be a triangle, but it's going to be whatever shape is on top, right? So the difference between the demand curve and the price that the monopolist charges, this is going to be our consumer surplus from a monopolist. Now, what was it at the perfectly competitive point? It would have been this entire area. So what happened to consumer surplus? It went down. what is producer surplus? Well, what is the marginal benefit to the producer? The benefit to them when they sell something is the price. What is their marginal costs? Well, here we've got a marginal cost curve, but in general, we think about this as like their marginal costs represented by the supply curve. So producer surplus is the difference between the price they're charging and their supply curve at every quantity they choose to sell. So here, the shape of producer surplus, that's always going to be the one that's on the bottom. Okay. Now here it happens to be a triangle plus a rectangle, right? So we've got a little bit more work to do. But if I had some values to this, we could calculate this, I think, relatively, we can find the area of rectangles and triangles. Okay. Any questions on this? And then deadweight loss would have just been, okay, where would the perfectly competitive market produce? Where supply is equal to demand. So for every unit here, what is total surplus? It's the difference between the marginal benefits and the marginal cost to the market. What represents marginal benefits in the market? Demand. What represents our marginal costs? That supply curve. So all of this surplus is what we lost. Okay. So it looks kind of similar to like price ceilings almost, right? Or sorry, price floors, right? Any questions on this idea? Like that, we kind of talked about deadweight loss between these two markets last week or last class, but I wanted to kind of identify this consumer and producer surplus for us here as well. Okay. So extending this a little bit further, I'm just going to draw this out again, and we're going to actually use some equations. Okay. So I've got my demand curve. Let's say I've got a demand curve represented by this equation. Okay. So that's telling me my demand curve is starting out at 100 when quantity is 0, and the slope is -5. Okay. I'm also going to give us a nice simplifying assumption. So you could do all of this with equations where you have increasing marginal cost. If I give you an equation example, like you might see in the practice problems or the quiz this week, I will give you a nice simplifying constant marginal cost simply equal to one value. Makes the math a little bit easier. You would do the exact same kind of procedure if you didn't. I'm not going to push you guys that far. Okay. And we'll see why. I think more of the models we talk about, this simplifying assumption of constant marginal cost, we'll use it in a lot of what we do this week, and I won't push you any further than that in some of these areas. Okay. So if I've got this constant well, geez, that's not constant. If I have this constant marginal cost of 50, where is the perfectly competitive quantity going to be? Well, what does marginal cost represent, or what represents marginal costs? My supply curve. So I'm looking for that perfectly competitive quantity. It's going to be where demand is equal to that marginal cost, which represents supply. So here, what? 100 minus 5Q is equal to 50. It's just a little bit of algebra. I subtract 50 from both sides, move the 5Q over. I've got what? 50 is equal to 5Q, divide both sides by 5, and I get that perfectly competitive quantity is going to be here at 10 units. Okay. So anything that we do visually, you can always do the same thing just with equations. Lines on a graph are just equations. Okay? So I'm going to look for that point where demand is equal to my marginal cost. We're okay with that? Everybody with me so far? Okay. What's going to be the price in this perfectly competitive market? So if this is the equilibrium quantity, the equilibrium price would just be 50. Kind of makes it easier. I don't have kind of this increasing marginal cost. Here, if we had constant marginal cost in a perfectly competitive market, that ends up being the price, right? Price, the competition drives it down to whatever the marginal cost would be. So perfectly competitive price over here at 50. Okay. So if I then want to kind of continue on, so this was like my perfectly competitive market. If I instead think about my monopoly market, and here this is where we have only talked about up to this point, single price monopolists. They're going to make decisions based off of a what? Twice as steep marginal revenue curve. So what is the equation for that going to look like? Well, it's going to start out at the same point as my demand curve. So it starts out at 100. Twice as steep would mean the slope would be what? The slope of my demand curve is -5. Then my marginal revenue curve would be, it's not a trick question. Hopefully we can figure out, right? -10, right? Twice as steep. All you're doing is taking the old slope of the demand curve and multiplying it by 2. It's twice as steep. So now what point am I looking for in terms of what's the, I didn't want to write this in here yet. What is the max quantity that maximizes profit for the monopolist? Well, I would simply set my marginal revenue equal to my marginal cost. So 100 minus 10Q is equal to that constant marginal cost of 50. Now it's just a little bit of algebra. So I move things around, subtract 50 from both sides, add 10Q to both sides. I get what? 50 is equal to 10Q. So the quantity is equal to what? 5. Just a little bit of algebra there. So I get my profit maximizing quantity for monopolists. Oh, sure enough, lines up with what we were talking about. We said that because they're making decisions off this twice as steep marginal revenue curve, the quantity the monopolist chooses will always be lower than a perfectly competitive market. Now we know the price they set is always going to be higher or lower. Higher, right? They've got monopoly power. How do we find that price? So the first thing we did was find where marginal revenue said we would do what? Go up to what to find the price? Up to my demand curve, right? Now, what does that look like? So if I'm going up to my demand curve to figure out what this monopoly price is, how would I use equations to do that? I'm thinking about at that quantity of 5, where am I at on my demand curve up here? All I'm going to do is take that demand curve and plug in my quantity of 5. So the price that would correspond to a quantity of 5 would be what? 75. So I can find the perfectly competitive price by simply setting demand equal to supply. How can I find the monopoly's profit maximizing quantity price? Well, there it's a little different. I set the marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. How did I find marginal revenue? It started out as the same point as demand, but twice as steep. Once I have that quantity, I then, second step, usually we said we would go up to the demand curve to find the price. With equations, you plug that quantity into your demand curve to find the corresponding price. It's the same thing. We're just talking in terms of equations as opposed to the visual. Okay. Any questions over anything up to this point? This is kind of making sense here. So I'm going to take this away. So everyone got this for right now. So once we have these quantities and prices, hopefully what I was telling you is true. We can start to think about things like, what is consumer surplus in a perfectly competitive market? And what is it when this market would have or be monopolized? So in a perfectly competitive market, what is consumer surplus? So once again, it's the difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs. So that's just the difference between our demand curve and our marginal cost here. So that would be what? This entire triangle. So here, consumer surplus would be what? 100 minus 50 is the height, times 0 to 10 is the width, times 1/2. So I end up with what? 250 if I'm doing math. Wait. Yes, 250 if I'm doing math in my head correct. Okay. For the monopolist, where would consumer surplus be? It's not the entire triangle. It's the difference between the demand curve and their here, not the sorry, I said marginal cost here. What is the consumer's marginal costs? In a perfectly competitive market, that was the exact same thing as the price. For the monopolist, their marginal, right? You still kind of have this difference. In the monopoly market, now consumers won't pay this lower price of 50. What are they going to pay? They're going to pay this higher monopoly price. So for them, consumer surplus is the difference between that new higher price and our demand curve. So that area is going to be what? 100 minus 75. The width of that triangle is 5. So I get what? 62.5, if I'm doing math in my head correct here. Okay. So what's happened to consumer surplus if we go from a perfectly competitive market to a monopoly market? It's went down, right? And here, this is once again where like we can remember this. Sometimes the questions you'll get asked even on like the final exam might just be like the directional change. What happens to the consumer surplus? But if you have a visual, if you have a graph, or in this case we had equations, we can always prove that to ourselves, right? Now, what about producer surplus? So producer surplus, what was the marginal benefit to producers? That would be the price. What's their marginal costs? Well, here we have a marginal cost curve, or more generally, we would say that kind of represents supply. So for the perfectly competitive market, this is kind of a weird one. We have constant marginal cost. What is producer surplus? So the price is exactly equal to marginal cost if it's constant. So their producer surplus is actually what? If price is equal to marginal cost, producer surplus at every quantity is 0. Right? What about for a monopolist? Well, there, the difference between the price they set and their marginal cost up to the number of units they sell, that would be this rectangle here. So what? The height is going to be 75 minus 50 times the width. We're going from 0 to 5. We don't times a half because it's a rectangle, right? We're just finding the area of shapes. We have producer surplus. What happened when it's a monopoly? Producer surplus goes up. Okay. So we've proven to ourselves, at least these things we were saying, with actual values. Now, here's where I could find deadweight loss using my visual here. But if I were to just give you these numbers, how could I figure out what deadweight loss is? So what would total surplus be in both of these markets? It would just be the sum of what? Consumer and producer surplus. So what is total surplus in my perfectly competitive market? 0 plus 250. So 250. What is it in my monopoly market? 125 plus 62.5. So what? 187.5, if I'm doing math in my head correct. So how much surplus was lost here? It would be the difference between the perfectly competitive and the monopoly total surplus. So that ends up just being what? 62.5. Now, if I wanted to, I don't have to do it that way because I've got the visual. What area here would represent deadweight loss? Well, it was all these units that the monopolist is no longer selling. The difference between the supply curve and the demand curve there, this would be my deadweight loss, which, right, has what? A height of 25, width of 25. It's a triangle. So sure enough, if I enter this in my calculator, I should get that same value as if I looked for the difference in the total surplus values. So we can identify it using the graph, and usually that'll be, you'll have that, you'll be able to do that. I'm just trying to make a point here what deadweight loss is really telling us. It's the reduction in total surplus from having a monopoly market relative to a perfectly competitive market. Okay. I try to color code things here to make it a little bit easier. Any questions here before we keep on moving? So what happened to consumer surplus with a monopoly? It goes down. Producer surplus goes up. Deadweight loss or total deadweight loss exists, so total surplus is going to go down. Okay. So everybody got this before we jump back to the slides here. Oh, I asked that and then didn't give you guys time to respond. Everybody okay with this? Okay. So hopefully this won't be too crazy, but let's say, and I kind of have this just as an additional kind of problem that we can kind of think through. So we know the answer here, but how do we get to that answer? So if I didn't have constant marginal cost and I wanted you to find deadweight loss, and we just found it with a constant marginal cost, what quantity is the perfectly competitive market going to choose or arrive at, I should say, wherever my demand curve hits supply, or if I only have one firm, their marginal cost would represent the supply curve. So demand hits that marginal cost curve, looks like at 22.5. That's the perfectly competitive quantity. Where is the monopolist going to choose? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That's at a quantity of 15. So the fact that we're underproducing, where is deadweight loss going to be? Well, every single unit here from 15 to 22.5, the surplus we're missing out on is the difference between our demand curve and that supply curve represented by our marginal costs, right? So we're thinking about there, what would the kind of width be? We're going from 15 to 22.5, so 7.5. We go up to the demand curve. The difference between that demand curve and that point where marginal cost is marginal revenue, the height of my triangle is what? 15. 15 times 7.5 times a half. So you can find deadweight loss even if we don't have these kind of nice constant marginal costs. It's just for every quantity the market is not producing because it's a monopoly market, what's the difference between supply and demand there? Or what's the difference between demand and here? What would be supply or marginal cost? Any questions on that before we keep moving? You know, if you really wanted to, you could use this. And maybe I use a picture similar. You could do like producer surplus, calculate it here. You could do consumer surplus, calculate it from a graph like this as well. Okay. Any other questions there before we keep moving here? All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is price discriminating monopolists. Okay. So up to this point, we've kind of assumed that the monopolist is setting a single price and selling it to people, right? Now, what would be better is if I could figure out how much people are willing to pay. If I know that someone's willing to pay a higher price, what would I want to do as a firm? Charge them a higher price. What if someone's willing to pay a lower price? If I keep selling it at the current price, if that's above what they're willing to pay, how many are they going to buy? 0. Now, what if the price they're willing to pay is still above my average total cost? Because we know the monopolist isn't at that minimum point of the average total cost curve. So sometimes, even though there's people who are willing to pay less, I could charge them a lower price and still earn some level of profit. So in an ideal world, if I could identify how much every person was willing to pay, as the monopolist, in order to maximize my profits, how much would I want to charge that person? So what tells us the consumer's willingness and ability to pay? The demand curve. So I would want to charge them a price that's exactly equal to, what does the demand curve represent? Their marginal benefit, right? So if I could, that would be how I could maximize my profits. So that would be the idea of like a perfectly price discriminating monopolist. So we can kind of think about relative to a single price monopolist, they're going to choose where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So once again, I added in this simplifying assumption of constant marginal cost to make our life a little bit easier, talking about these price discriminating monopolists. And that's as far as I'd kind of push you. Okay. So here would be consumer surplus. Here's my producer surplus. Here, if I have constant marginal cost, I assume there's no fixed cost. It actually becomes the same as average total. I wouldn't necessarily expect you to know that, but it kind of makes it nice in these constant marginal cost examples. We can think about our producer surplus really is representing profits, right? There's the difference between price and the average total cost here. Okay. So we've got deadweight loss as a result of a single price monopolist. If I can price discriminate, what's going to happen? So let's say I'm going to do something slightly different here before we go back to the slides that I think will help maybe solidify this idea. So let's say I've got constant marginal costs here, and I said this kind of ends up being my average total cost, right? So if I don't act like a single price monopolist, I'm not going to set a single price based off of my marginal revenue curve. Let's think about this in terms of the number of consumers, just to make it a little bit easier. Let's say the first person, whatever product I'm selling, the amount they'd be willing to pay for this good is $50. How much am I going to charge them if I can figure that out? Exactly 50, right? So the price for that first person is going to be $50. Now, if I charged a single price of 50, that second person is only willing to pay 40. Are they going to buy that? No. But if I can identify who this second person is, and I know they'd be willing to pay up to $40, what price would I charge them? $40. Now, I know they'll be indifferent, right? They'd either buy it or not. So maybe like in practice, I charge them $40.05, right? Something just above, or sorry, $39.95, something just below that to guarantee. But here we're thinking about like perfect price in an ideal world where if people are indifferent, we would still see them kind of buy this product. That continues all the way down where for every person who values it a little bit less and less, I'm charging them lower prices, but notice that price is still above average total cost. So I'm still earning profit on every single person I'm selling to. What's the last person I'd be willing to sell to? Well, when that price I can charge them is exactly equal to that average total cost. Well, now notice, if this is marginal cost, this is demand. The quantity that a price discriminating monopolist would stop at ends up being the same as the quantity of what? Supply is equal to demand. This would be a perfectly competitive market. So if we get to the quantity that a perfectly competitive market would get to, what should be true about deadweight loss? It's equal to 0. We've actually maximized total surplus. Now we'll talk about, it's a little bit different than a perfectly competitive market here in a second, but we at least get to that quantity. What is the marginal revenue of a perfectly price discriminating monopolist? Well, what is the marginal revenue for a firm? If I think about total revenue is price times quantity, you could do like a derivative. If I sell one more unit, what's the marginal revenue? The price. If I was setting a single price. Now here I'm charging different prices. So at every quantity, the marginal revenue is going to be the price I charge. So my demand curve becomes my marginal revenue curve. So it might seem like it violates this rule we talked about for single price monopolists, but a price discriminating monopolist is still going to set the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. It's just that they don't have to charge a single price, so they don't face the twice as steep marginal revenue curve. If they can charge different prices, their marginal revenue curve is the demand curve. So marginal revenue equals marginal cost at that same quantity as the perfectly competitive market we get to. Okay? Any questions on this idea before we keep moving here? So we already said if we can get to that perfectly competitive quantity, deadweight loss is 0. What is consumer surplus? So we said, I'm hammering this home, but difference between the marginal benefits and marginal cost to consumers. What represents their marginal benefits? Demand curve. What represents the marginal cost to consumers? The price they pay. if I'm charging them a price exactly equal to their marginal benefit, that is the demand curve. What's consumer surplus here? 0, right? If you can perfectly price discriminate, you can drive consumer surplus down to 0. Now, where would producer surplus be? So that's going to be the difference between the marginal benefits to the firm, which is the price they're charging, and the difference between that and the supply curve or their marginal costs. So notice producer surplus would be all of total surplus. So when we have these perfectly price discriminating monopolists, yes, we've reduced deadweight loss, but who is hurt in this market? Consumers a lot. Who really likes this? Producers. Okay. So this is the idea of perfect price discrimination. Okay. Any questions before we keep moving there? Okay. And we'll look at this in a couple different contexts here in just a second. Okay. So we said basically there's no deadweight loss. All of what used to be consumer surplus has now been kind of transferred over to producers. Okay. So what ends up happening with some bullet points here? Well, relative to a single price monopolist, the quantity went back out to the perfect. So sales or quantity is going to go up, right? We said total welfare or total surplus will increase. Deadweight loss is going to go to 0. Now, the price that is going to be charged, I kind of set this up as like each consumer. Now, we can think about, you might buy more than one of a product. So we'll talk about quantity discounting and quantity price discrimination here in a second. But really the idea is, who am I going to be charging these higher prices to? Whoever has a higher willingness and ability to pay, whoever has kind of higher up in that demand curve. Another way we represent, what does demand start out as? We talked about this a little bit last class. Elastic or inelastic? Elastic, right? So we kind of have this difference in the demand curve. We have different types of consumers. Who am I going to want to charge a higher price to? If someone is really responsive to prices, if I charge a higher price, what might they do? Buy nothing, right? Or decrease. So elastic people, I'm going to want to actually try to target with lower prices, whereas inelastic people, I want to try to target with higher prices. So we'll think about this idea of elasticity when I kind of run through some examples here in a second. Okay. We're going to skip ahead. We'll come back to quantity discounting in a second. I want to use this graph to kind of make some points. We'll then kind of do an in-class quiz. I'll then talk through, I think, some more examples of what price discrimination looks like, just to kind of give us a little bit more insight into really how this plays out. So let's compare all 3 of these markets. We've now talked about, well, actually, we've got enough. Let's get the quiz out of the way here. And then we'll kind of come back. I'll give you guys a bit of a break. Okay. So I feel like being nice today. And I'll kind of walk through everyone who's here with us, all right? I don't think this will take us too long. There should be some pretty easy questions. Even if we work through these together, these are always good questions to go back and review. Okay? I hit the publish button, but I didn't check to make sure. Is it popping up there for you guys? So we've got this quiz. I think I have it set to be due quite a bit later in class, so we should have plenty of time to kind of get through it. If I have a price discriminating monopolist, what's the profit maximizing quantity going to be here? So they're perfectly price discriminating. The quantity is going to be not where a twice as steep marginal revenue curve hits marginal cost. It's going to be where what hits our marginal cost curve. What is the marginal revenue, or what becomes the marginal revenue curve for a price discriminating monopolist? Demand, right? So their marginal revenue curve, if they can price discriminate, it would actually be the original demand curve. So that would be out of a quantity of what? 22.5. So relative to a single price monopolist, where were they going to choose the optimal quantity? Were the twice as steep marginal revenue curve hit marginal cost? So they were going to choose a quantity of 15. So the perfectly price discriminating monopolist actually chose a quantity that was higher, right? At 22.5. Okay. Any questions there? So I've got now an example that we had constant marginal cost before. It works the same way as if we don't have constant marginal cost. It's just the surplus stuff gets a little bit more tricky. So that's why when I ask you questions about surplus, I'll kind of keep it with constant marginal cost. But if I ask you to identify where the perfectly priced discriminating quantity would be, it's just where that marginal cost hits the demand curve. Okay? Any questions on that? Okay. If I've got this perfectly priced discriminating monopolist, well, we already see it here, but what would my consumer surplus be? We said if I can charge people exactly what their marginal benefit is, the difference between their marginal benefit and the price they pay would then be 0 for every single consumer. So consumer surplus, if I can perfectly price discriminate, will be driven down to 0. All right. Similar kind of idea. What would deadweight loss be? Well, we said if we get out to this point, demand becomes the marginal revenue curve for the price discriminating monopolist. That quantity of 22.5 is also the quantity for what type of market? So where demand is equal to one firm's marginal cost, which would represent supply. So that would be the quantity of A. We only talked about one other type of market last week. Perfectly competitive, right? So if we're at that perfectly competitive quantity, we know that we're at the point where total surplus is maximized. Deadweight loss is also going to be 0. Okay. So those are numerical responses. So make sure you're putting zeros in there, right? And then we kind of had that quantity from the first one was 22.5. Okay. Any questions on that before we kind of jump back into the slides here? So a way for me to make sure you're in here and paying attention today. It should be easy points to get these. Okay. All right. Everyone good? All right. And let's make sure here. I think I had it set to be due at 10:30. So just make sure you're getting it submitted here. I'll make sure I set the time. Yeah. So you've got plenty of time to kind of get on and get that done here in the next couple of minutes. Okay. Well, hopefully you were doing it as we were talking through it, but yeah, it's not like it'll. Okay. So let's start to think a little bit more about these different types of markets we now have. We've got a perfectly competitive market. We've got a single price monopolist, and we have a perfectly price discriminating monopolist. Okay. So if I had a perfectly competitive market, the quantity is going to be out here where supply or the marginal cost curve is equal to demand. What would total surplus be? Total surplus is the difference between my marginal benefits to the market and marginal cost to the market. So just the difference between my demand curve and the supply curve, which if I only have one firm, their marginal cost is supply. So we could kind of write marginal cost equal to supply here, if that helps. So total surplus in this perfectly competitive market will be this entire area, A plus B plus C. Okay. What would producer surplus be? Well, if it's a perfectly competitive market, we said the price that they charge is 100 here. If that's the same as my my marginal cost or my supply curve, the difference between the marginal benefit price to the producer and their marginal cost, that difference is 0. So in a perfectly competitive market with constant marginal cost, producer surplus is 0. It's a perfectly competitive market. So hopefully this is just like a textbook definition thing. Deadweight loss will always be 0. That's where total surplus should be maximized. So here our total surplus is this entire area, but all of surplus is consumer surplus. So once again, when we have competitive markets, who benefits? You and me, consumers, right? Now let's say this market only has one firm, or it has a monopoly. Where's the new price going to be? Well, the monopolist will choose the quantity where marginal revenue, which is twice as steep as demand, is equal to marginal cost. So they're going to produce at a lower quantity, and relative to the perfectly competitive price of 100, they're going to set a higher price. Okay. So what is kind of the total surplus going to be now in this market? Well, we no longer see these units from 100 to 200 being sold. So this area of C is going to represent our deadweight loss. What is consumer surplus? What's the marginal benefit to consumers? The demand curve. Marginal cost is the price. So now for consumers, their surplus is only going to be area A. What would producer surplus be? What's their marginal benefit? The price, difference between that and their marginal cost. So producer surplus is area B. What is kind of total surplus? Well, we don't add in deadweight loss here, right? Total surplus is just the sum of producers and consumers. So we only have A plus B. So this is all the things we talked about. With a monopoly market, what happened to consumer surplus relative to a perfectly competitive market? It went from A plus B plus C to A, so it went down. What happened to producer surplus? 0 to anything, it went up. Deadweight loss, 0 to anything, it went up. If deadweight loss is higher, that represents a loss of surplus. What had to happen to total welfare or total surplus? It went down. You lost C here. Now, any questions on that before we make the next comparison? So if I have a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, now what's going to happen? Well, they don't make a decision based off this twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Their marginal revenue becomes what? The demand curve. So they're going to produce out of this quantity of 200 again. All of this will be surplus, the difference between the demand curve and our marginal cost or supply curve. So total surplus is back to being maximized. No deadweight loss. The problem is, if I'm charging every consumer a different price, and it's exactly equal to their marginal benefit, we said consumer surplus will now be 0. Producer surplus will be the difference between the price they're charging, their marginal cost. So producer surplus will be all of total surplus, or A plus B plus C. So if I was a monopoly, if I can start to price discriminate, what am I doing? Relative to if I was charging a single price, if I can price discriminate, I'm going to do what to consumer surplus? Well, anything to 0, I'm going to decrease it. Producer surplus, B to A plus B plus C, I'm going to increase it. I'm going to drive deadweight loss down to 0, which means I'm actually also going to then increase total surplus. Now, this gets a little philosophical. Is this a good thing for society? Well, we've reduced deadweight loss, but who's hurt? Consumers. You know, in general, I don't know, we place value on like the utility of consumers a little higher than the utility of firms, or at least I would argue we should, right? So maybe we need a more complicated model, but for the sake of what we're doing in this class, this is all I'm going to ask you to analyze, okay? Those differences in producer, consumer, surplus, deadweight loss between these markets, okay? Any questions before we get to, I think, a little bit more of a fun discussion here? Okay, so in the real world, how does this price discrimination play out, right? I want to charge people higher prices that have higher willingness and ability to pay, right? So what I'm going to try to do is use characteristics or observables about my consumers or my consumer base. I'm going to try to use terms that are a little more business oriented. I'm not technically in a business school, but I was in one for forever, so I know what they talk about. So if I've got these observables or these characteristics of my consumer base that I think might indicate they're willing to pay more, I'm going to try to target them with higher pricing. So what does this look like, right? So I have a neighbor I was talking to the other day. She's like, oh, we took our kid, I think it's the movie theater. This is kind of seems like an old example. It's movie theaters and no one goes there anymore. But they were like, oh, the tickets are like $5 for an adult and $3 for children. Well, what is that? Is that a single price? No. They're using a characteristic about children, and they're saying, well, look, we know parents, hell, you might take the kid there, they might start crying, you might have to leave early. It's a bit of a hassle to take your kid to the movies. And so what is their ability and willingness to pay for a child ticket? Lower, right? So what ends up happening to the price that they charge for children's tickets? Lower. What do they also know? If you have children, what's likely to be true about the amount of disposable income you have? Less, right? So if you have lower income, is your ability to pay going to be higher or lower? Lower. You know you're going to not have the ability and, sorry, the willingness or the ability to pay that higher price, right? So anytime we see like discounts based off of like a characteristic, that's price discrimination. If you go to like local diners, like the coffee for seniors, there's always like a senior citizen discount. Why? Most senior citizens are on what kind of income? Fixed income, right? Their ability to pay is lower than someone of working age. So we see this pop up quite a bit, right? In terms of like just these kind of discounts. I always use this example too, like discount coupons. If I'm Bill Gates, so I get like these things in the mail from Kroger, like every week you get like coupons. You think Bill Gates sits down and goes through and says, "Oh, what's on sale this week? That's what I'm going to try to make for dinner." No, right? He doesn't care about the price. Do you think a family of, 4 or 5 kids, making, 40,000 a year, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to make sure whatever's on sale, they're trying to buy that. We're going to go through those coupons and take that additional time. What are they doing once they use those coupons? They're paying a lower price, right? Kroger's identified, well, look, we'll just send all these out, and the people that are already going to be willing to pay a higher price, like Bill Gates, they'll keep paying the higher price. It's not worth their time to hunt through these coupons. But people who wouldn't have been willing to buy these goods before, with these coupons, maybe now I can convince them paying a slightly lower price to actually come and buy those goods. So what have I done? Still selling the same number to Bill Gates, but I'm selling more to these other families, right? So as long as that new lower price is above my average total cost, I've earned profits off of those individuals. So another example we see, and I'll work through one more here in a second, but quantity discounts. So I don't know, I was like in movie theaters when I wrote these slides. But anytime you go to buy something, actually, I'll give you an example from my life. Maybe you can connect this. If you guys ever might see me walking back and forth, I have a terrible addiction. My addiction is to diet soda. And after class, I will almost routinely walk down to Circle K and get a 44 ounce of Diet Mountain Dew. This started when I was in college, and I have yet to kick the habit, right? So why don't I get the 32 ounce? The 32 ounce is like, 89 cents, and the 44 ounce is 99. So what are they doing? They're not charging the same per fluid ounce. What's true? They figure most people, 32 ounces, every ounce I have, I'm willing to pay less and less for. So if I want to convince someone to go from 32 to 44, what am I going to have to do? Lower the price, right? The price per fluid ounce is going to be a little bit lower. Okay, that's the idea of quantity discount. Now, you also see this play out in things like 2 for 1, right? They know that the second unit you buy, if I'm at the gas station, they have like 2 for 1 candy. They know because, like, yeah, I might want a candy bar. I know I don't need the second, but if I have to keep paying the same higher price, I'm not going to buy the second one. But if you tell me it's 2 for 1, then really, what's the price of that second? Oh, it's quite a bit. I mean, it's 0. Or, maybe I do like buy one, get 1 half off or something like that. So this idea of quantity discounting, we'll break that down here with a visual in just a second, but that's another example we see of price discrimination. Another one that's probably pretty familiar to a lot of you is need-based financial, not to say it to a lot, but like need-based financial aid, right? You apply for, what is it, Pell Grants and, why am I blanking on the other one? But basically, need-based financial aid is saying, we know you don't have the ability to pay as much for tuition, so we're going to charge you essentially a lower tuition. They're charging, all of you are not paying the same price, whether it's through need-based financial aid, scholarships, all these things. You're all paying very different values for tuition, in versus out of state. Why is out of state tuition higher? Why does Kelly, the IU, charge you more for being out of state? Because they know if you're out of state and you're applying here, what must be true? You know the price is higher, so you must really want to go here. So what do they know is true about your demand? It's going to be a lot more inelastic. They know that for in-state, well, I could choose to go to IU, I could choose to go to Purdue, I could choose to go to Indiana State, all these other. So for you, what might be true if IU increases their price? For an in-state student, they might just go to one of the other universities. They're going to be a lot more elastic. So out of state, in state, yes, politicians will say we're trying to do some protection of our own citizens, whatever. People are so mobile in the US. The real reason is why, because we know that characteristic about applicants from out of state versus in state, it's going to be very different ability and willingness to pay. We can get away with charging those out of state a much higher tuition price, right? That's price discrimination. You're paying different prices, okay? So these are all some kind of examples of price discrimination that we can talk through. We've got, 20 minutes. I want to make sure I save enough time, but I'll talk through one more before I kind of finish out in the So actually play out and this happens. So if we went back like 50 years, a lot of these examples I'm using are probably what is happening with price discrimination. What has made it easier for companies to price discriminate? It's all been around all the time pretty much since you guys have been alive. social media, the internet, online data. They can see what you look at, right? So I know that this happens because, well, it would be dumb if they didn't. If you go, like I was looking at like Fanatics one day, like how like some type of apparel for a sports team. If you look at something enough, all of a sudden you'll go back there and or they'll send you an email. Oh, this is marked down. Not everyone's seeing the exact same prices, right? I use another one where they do like exploding deals to use price information. So Panera has this thing called a sip club. You can get like caught if you go to Panera, like it's a hell of a deal. Like I go there a lot with my wife and like you can get a huge iced coffee. You pay one thing a month, you get it every single day. So I go down there to get my iced coffee. I usually do my order on my phone. I have to write a phone by the time I get there. I have to wait. If I want to buy a bagel, I want to add that to my order. I can add it. It's like, I don't know, $3 or whatever they charge for a bagel. And I can hit enter. Okay, I got a free drink and I paid for the bagel. Right? They're hoping I do that. I don't think their bagels are worth that much, so I just hit enter, see zero for the cost of that. I'm already paying for the monthly thing. I get my drink for free. As soon as I hit enter to go check out and pay, what pops up on my phone? Exploding offer. In the next minute, you can get a bagel for $1. Well, why do they do that? Because they knew I wasn't willing to pay the sticker price of $3 because I already hit submit on the phone, right? They know that if I want to buy it, I must be willing to pay a lower price. Now, I don't ever buy it for $1 because I'm really a bagel fan. But if I was, like, maybe I was, oh yeah, I wasn't going to pay $3, but I'll pay $1 for it. So you'll see a lot of these things if you go to check out, you'll get an exploding offer. Well, it's basically because they know, looking at their catalog, you weren't willing to pay whatever the sticker price is. But maybe you'll pay this lower price. And they'll still keep those prices above their average total cost. So if they convince you to buy it, well, if I don't buy the bagel, they still get zero. They're no worse off. If I now do buy it for $1, well, I wasn't going to buy it at free, so they didn't lose out anything, but now they've made an additional $1. So we see examples of this price discrimination pop up a lot more often now that we kind of have the internet tracking of kind of what you're looking at in your phone, things like the previous transactions. We see it play out a lot more, okay? All right, so I'll give you one more example of thinking about, we're talking about monopolies, we're talking about perfectly competitive markets, but why the hell am I making the comparison? It's not like market jump to back and forth every single day. Right? It's not like all of a sudden the market for higher education is a monopoly and then now it's perfectly competitive. Well, what kind of one of the things we said creative monopolies are barriers to entry that can sometimes be created by the government. So another really good example of this is something like a patent. So if a drug company has a patent, potentially they have monopoly power for a short window of time. So what can they do with a patent? They're setting this single price. They're the only person selling this drug. They're going to earn positive profits. So the government might give these patents out because what's really expensive, or if I want to come up with a new drug, what do I have to dump a bunch of money into? New product, new drugs, research and development. If I dump all of my money into research and development, come up with a new drug, and now it's just chemistry. Everyone can just back engineer it. Other companies can start selling the drug. What don't they have? That huge fixed cost of research and development. So if that's the case, what does every company do? Well, I don't want to be the one, if there's no patent that I can get on this, I don't want to be the one that comes up with this drug. I spent a bunch of money, now everybody else can just back engineer it. So the government will create patents that guarantee, okay, if you do come up with this new product, you can get a patent for it and you can earn positive profits for X number of years. So that's a monopoly market. Now, as soon as that patent expires, what happens? Everybody just back engineers that drug. Now all these drug companies drive the price down to this perfectly competitive point. So now what are the profits? Zero, right? So if there isn't this patent that protects the firms, I know profits are going to be zero. And this hasn't factored in. We're just looking at constant marginal cost. This doesn't take into consideration the firm that's really going to come up with this drug. We'd have to add in a huge fixed cost here as well, which would mean they put the money into research and development. If everyone else can just back engineer it, I'm going to be the one that loses that. Everybody else will be operating here. They didn't have to pay the huge fixed cost of research and development, but the firm that did, they're going to have negative profits. So they decide to ever put money into research and development? No. We'll actually kind of talk through a little bit more of this kind of game theory idea about like who puts money into research and development a little bit more next week. That's kind of foreshadowing a little bit, but trying to give you some real world examples of thinking about why we make the comparison of monopoly to perfectly competitive markets. It's not like once the perfect competitive market, it's always, or once the monopoly market, it's always a monopoly market. We can kind of see, depending on, government regulation, maybe it starts out as a monopoly market over time, the patent expires, now it operates more like a perfect competitive market. Okay. The next thing we're going to talk about, I'm going to give you an example of a natural monopoly and then talk about some government regulation that can help assist when we have these examples of natural monopolies. So I'm going to use the slide first, and then I'm going to jump to kind of showing you the regulation part using the dot cam. So let's say I had a single price monopolist. They're going to choose the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to, I'm a little bit off, but marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Go up the demand curve, set the price. What's true about my profits? Price is above average total costs, right? So my profits are positive. Quantity we're selling times the difference between price and average total cost here. So if there's positive profits, let's say there's no barriers to entry in terms of like government regulations with patents. What might another firm want to do? Enter this market. If they enter this market, let's just assume even with two firms, we now have perfect competition, right? It's enough competition to drive us down to the perfect competitive point. Where is the new quantity going to be as soon as we get this competition? Where demand is equal to supply or the marginal cost. So as soon as that second firm enters, what is the profit of each firm? Well, now the difference between the price they're charging, much lower, and their average total cost is now above price. We now have both firms are actually earning negative profits. So what is one firm going to do? Exit the market. Now we're back to one firm with positive profits. This is the idea of a natural monopoly. There's only enough demand given the current cost structure to support one firm in the long run. This can happen, right? I think I use examples last because like a lot of times like electric companies, there's huge fixed costs. Anything where there's huge fixed costs, a lot of times there's only enough demand to support one firm. So if we have this natural monopoly, what do we know is going to exist? Anytime we have a monopoly, what is created in the market that we don't like? It's an evil word. Starts with a D. It's a loss of surplus, deadweight loss. All right. So let's say I've got this monopolist. We'll keep marginal cost constant just to make this a little bit easier. And here's my average total cost. Okay. Now we said with a monopolist, whether it's a natural monopoly or not, we know they're not going to be operating on the minimum point of their average total cost curve. Remember? So even if we, in this example, it's even more obvious because even if we can get to that perfectly competitive point, it doesn't exist. We can't have a perfectly competitive market here. This was the idea of a natural monopoly. But we know that the monopolist will always be on a portion of the average total cost curve that's not at its minimum. Okay. So they choose the profit maximizing quantity, profit maximizing price, difference between price and average total cost here. This is going to be the level of profits for the monopolist where they are maximized. Okay. So if I'm looking at this, where is consumer surplus? It's going to be the area above price, but below my demand curve. Okay. So we kind of started out. Here was consumer surplus. If I'm the government and I actually care about my citizens, bit of a stretch. But if I want to improve the life of my consumers, what if I lowered the price down to here? So how can I lower the price here as the government? The price the monopolist sets is this high. What could I impose that doesn't prevent, or sorry, that prevents the price from going any higher? Price ceiling. Well, now the monopolist doesn't get to choose that profit maximizing quantity. They have to charge, this is the highest possible price they can charge. At this price, well, now, if I have to charge this price, I can't get to the price I wanted to. Is that price I'm charging still above average total cost? Yes. So I might still have positive profits, but they're lower than before. They're lower than before the government regulation. Now, if I'm the government Why would I stop there? If I truly want to help my consumers, because notice lowering the price here, now the quantity has went up, prices went down. What's definitely going to happen to consumer surplus? People are buying more units. They're paying a lower price. Consumer surplus definitely has to go up, right? Well, why would I stop there? What if I keep lowering the price? Well, now at this higher quantity, consumer surplus is even higher. Where can I stop? Or where do I stop? As soon as I hit a price ceiling where average total cost is exactly equal to demand, what are firms' profits now? Price is equal to average total cost. I've driven the profits down to 0, all right? So if I can set a price ceiling where that demand curve is equal to my average total cost curve, right? I know that profits of the monopolist will now be 0. I've gotten consumer surplus as high as I possibly can. Why can't I then continue to lower the price? If I continue to kind of lower that price ceiling, well, now what happens for the firm? Price is below average total, so their profits would be negative. What does the firm do? They leave. Now what is consumer surplus? We started out, remember we had one firm. If one firm leaves, consumer surplus is now 0. We lose the entire market, right? So by lowering, kind of imposing this price ceiling, lowering the price, we can increase total surplus. Now, what are we also doing? We're reducing what? Deadweight loss. Now, can we reduce it completely? With a natural monopoly, like just given the cost structure, there's always going to be some amount of loss of surplus that we can't get to what would be a perfectly competitive quantity, because just to given the current cost structure, that would drive any firm out of the market. So what we'll do with kind of what we call marginal cost pricing, or kind of this price regulation of using a price ceiling, we can lower the price all the way down to where that average total cost curve hits demand. Now we know that the firms having 0 profits, they're indifferent about staying or entering. So in practice, do I really want to set it exactly equal to that point? I might err on the side of caution, set it like a little bit higher, just to guarantee there's still some positive profits in that industry. But that would be an idea of a price regulation where if we know that a monopoly is going to exist, it's a natural monopoly, there's only enough demand to support one firm, we're going to kind of create these price ceilings, not allow firms to kind of price gouge, right? When you hear this term, if you see in the news, oh, you know, this company's getting in trouble for price gouging. Well, it's really the government saying, look, we know that you have some monopoly power in this market. Come on, cut the consumers a little slack. Like, you shouldn't be charging these insanely high prices, you know, for whatever it is, like there's some disaster and, you know, these companies start charging like insanely high amounts for like generator or whatever it is, right? The government might step in and kind of set that price in to be a little bit lower, which helps consumers and kind of keeps those monopoly profits a little bit low. Sorry, I feel like I'm getting kind of excited about this stuff, but I like the further we get in this semester, it gets fun for me because like I'm actually talking about things that happen, right? Like I know we have simple model, like a little more simplistic models, but we see all this stuff play out in the real world, right? So with that in mind, where are we at with time here? All right. So I kind of talked about this. We'll kind of set that price with that demand curve, right? Price representing kind of that price quantity combination of the demand curve is equal to the average total cost. If we ever can get down to the marginal cost point, like if it wasn't a natural monopoly, we would want to continue to lower the price until we can get to that perfectly competitive point. It's just that we see this play out a lot more when we have these natural monopolies, which is why I kind of gave you that model. Okay. So found this meme at one point. I don't know, I thought it was funny. The monopoly you have in my heart is all natural. I'm not going to waste a ton of time here on this. This is just me referencing. Do we see the government actually do that? Like try to regulate monopolies? We've got a ton. A lot of them are like old acts. Like I said, we see them now try to prevent companies from price gouging. That's usually because we think that there's some type of maybe monopoly power that they have. We talked about the Postal Service last class. This is all just kind of, I don't know, summary slides. Before I let you get out of here, I don't think I have these slides in the ones that I posted. We'll kind of save this. We didn't have as much time as I quite thought. We'll talk about what would happen with like lower costs, and markups. So this kind of dives us into monopoly through competitive markets, which we're not going to talk about next week, but the following. Right? So we're going to use this idea of a monopoly market. It's going to be something that looks very similar, not next week, but the week after. Right? So we'll want to keep a lot of this in mind. We'll also talk about next week, looking at what we call game theory. Some of that will use some of the stuff that we talked about with monopolies as well. Right? So we want to make sure we have a good understanding of this. So before you guys get all excited and ready to leave, I got one more thing that I want to tell you. Okay. So that should kind of be good for you in terms of the quiz. I think especially that equation one, I can guarantee you'll see a problem like that. So there's a practice problem related to that. You'll see one on the quiz that's similar. Another thing that I did, and I will post this video tomorrow. So we are a healthy bunch today. So we go to the files tab. I put up this monopoly example and it's an Excel file. Okay. I will try to at some point tomorrow. I'm hoping to do it early, first thing when I get to my office. See how many emails I have waiting for me. I want to clean my inbox out a little bit. And I'm going to try to post a little video of me working through this Excel file. So I've been told by Kelly, this somewhat applies to you, somewhat doesn't. They want you guys to start getting a lot more Excel early on in your college career. Can't do that for this semester, so you guys lucked out in terms of it for this class. But I have ideas of how I'm going to do that. I also think, I try to do things in this class. I try to build or give you more of these models, sometimes push you more than just like learning definitions, because I want you to do better in your future classes, and I want you to have a better understanding of this material. So I'm going to put together this little video of me working through this Excel file. So if you're not super familiar with Excel, I'll try to be very slow with it. But it's going to build out, if I started out with just costs and demand curve, how could I figure out where monopoly profits are going to, like where the perfectly competitive quantity, monopoly profits would be? How do I calculate total revenues? All of these things might be really helpful for the quiz questions I give you. I might just give you price and quantity, give you the total costs. In order to figure out where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, you then need to know how do I find marginal revenue from this demand curve using a table. So this is going to be a much more complicated example than what I'm going to ask you on the quiz. But if you can watch me do this, then if I give you like 5 price quantity combinations with a lot nicer numbers, it's going to be a lot easier to do those on the quiz. So before you take the quiz, if you want to, I would hold off. This video might have some value to you. Now, this video is not like needed to do well at the quiz. We did work through similar models in class, but I'm also posting it not just to be helpful for the quiz. I'm mostly posting it because I'm hearing that they want you to have more knowledge about Excel, which is another resource for me to give you guys, because you're going to start seeing it more in your classes from here on out, at least from what I'm hearing, what Kelly is going to try to do. Okay? So I'm trying to kind of do you a solid there, so to speak. All right? So keep an eye out. That quiz will be posted a little bit later today. Next module reading should pop up pretty quickly after class. Have a fun, safe weekend. I will see you guys on Tuesday.
Thank you.